The date is July 20th, 1969, and the United States has just landed on the moon, claiming victory status in the 14-year-long space race against the USSR. But you and your mother already know this about the space race. The question is, do you and your mother know about the spice race? It's the spice race that gave us all these wonderful spices that we use every day and yet take for granted. I guarantee you have pepper somewhere in your kitchen. Oh, and by the way, don't use that trashed ground pepper, or as Internet Shaquille says,
McCormick dust.
It loses its flavor within 3 months of being ground. Get the whole peppercorns in a grinder. The whole peppercorn releases oils that add more flavor to your food. Anyways, you likely have pepper somewhere in your kitchen, and if you don't, you can go to the corner store and get a whole box of it for just a few bucks. This is a luxury that we've all taken for granted nearly every day. You see, back in the 15th century, pepper was nearly impossible to come by for the average person, and especially your average peasant. It could only be afforded by the super rich. Just so you know how expensive pepper was back in the 15th century, a pound of pepper cost $160 in today's money. That's more than 2 lobster and flaming on dinners at Keen's Steakhouse in Midtown Manhattan. But pepper wasn't expensive just because it made food taste better. Lots of spices did the same thing. It was also a very good food preservative. Still fresh. Why did you pepper a pound of beef and leave it out for 3 days? Don't you ask me about my business, woman. It's true that salt was also a common food preservative before pepper, but it tended to be overpowering in taste, because, surprise, salt is, well, really salty. Sure, you've heard of pepper steak, but have you ever heard of salt steak? Pepper wasn't always a distant, unknown culinary luxury that was just discovered in the Middle Ages. It was widely popular in the ancient world as well, and especially in the Mediterranean. Hey, Socrates was right, this gyro is way better with pepper. That guy is going places. People assume the ancients were isolated cultures that lacked technology or understanding to venture outside their immediate territories and establish trade with faraway countries. Quite the contrary, the Romans expanded their empire literally anywhere there was ground. Due to the aggressive expansion of the Roman Empire, the Romans had an extensive relationship with Middle Eastern merchants who traded both spices and incense via the incense route. You see, the incense route was very similar to the Silk Road, in that they were both ancient trade routes that began in the East, except the Silk Road began in China and the incense route began in India. It went through the Indian Ocean, up the Red Sea, and into the Mediterranean Sea. Pop quiz: which ancient culture was the first to use pepper, the Greeks or the Romans? The Greeks, though probably not in the way that you're thinking. The Greeks used pepper not as a culinary spice, but as a medicinal agent, most famously as an antidote to hemlock poison. Okay, Socrates, the punishment for corrupting the youth is to drink this hemlock poison, which you have chosen by your own free will. Yeah, and if you have any second thoughts, I have this pepper, which is the antidote, so don't worry if you, yeah, I'll be quiet. Pepper was only used in Greek cooking to treat symptoms and disorders. For example, the Greek physician Diphilus claimed that indigestion could be cured by eating scallops with pepper. In contrast, the Romans noticed pepper enhanced the flavor of food and pretty much went hog wild. An ancient Roman cookbook authored by Apicius included pepper in 351 of its 468 recipes. After the fall of the Roman Empire in 476, Europe went through a sort of hormonal teenage period known as the Dark Ages. Europe basically slammed the basement door, ate a bag of Cheetos, and watched MTV for about 500 years. As a result, technological and cultural advancement fell to the wayside, and Europe as a whole became isolationist. During this time as well, Christianity was rapidly growing across Europe, and the new Muslim religion was not something a growing Christian nation wanted anything to do with. Export and import of goods at one time being common between Europe and the Middle East was now off the table. Then, after the Dark Ages, between the 11th and 13th century, there was this tiny conflict called the Crusades. After 500 years of staying isolated, Europeans had a fever, and the only prescription was indulgences and reclaiming the Holy Land from the Muslims. Surprisingly, it was the Crusades that was the catalyst for the European interest in spices. Soldiers returned with spoils of war, with the popular one being pepper. Merchants noticed the returning soldiers' interest in this spice and quickly set up trade in Constantinople, the gateway to the Middle East. Out of all the European countries, Italy was in the best position to benefit from the spice trade. Being in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea and having a crazy number of ports gave it a major advantage over countries like Spain, Portugal, England, and France. Venice itself exploded into a commercial port during the spice trade and became the main hub for spice goods to enter into Europe. By the 15th century, a lot of European countries were getting fed up with Italy's monopoly on black pepper. Why, you ask? Well, because if the European countries wanted pepper, they were going to have to buy it at Italy's price. The rest of Europe had two choices. One, go to war with Italy and take control of their ports. But war was expensive and there was no guarantee of victory. Besides, whatever country was victorious would be faced with invasion from another country, wanting those sweet, sweet ports. The second choice was to find the route to India independently and set up trade at the source. As you can imagine, the second choice was much more attractive. And so the space race, oh no, that's an I, so there we are. And so the spice race began, and it would entail going where no European had gone before, south. Yeah, literally. No one had really gone south of Spain because there was no reason to. Most of the maritime sailing took place in the Mediterranean Sea, the Black Sea, the North Sea, and coastal parts of the Atlantic. No one wanted or needed to go south, but if they were going to get that sweet, sweet pepper, not this pepper, that pepper, they were going to have to go through the most difficult and stupid route imaginable, around Africa. France was one of the earliest countries to the race. French navigator Jean de Bethencourt discovered the Canary Islands in 1402. England contracted an Italian explorer by the name of John Cabot, who eventually made his way to Newfoundland. But Portugal was by far the most ambitious country. For starters, the son of King John I, Prince Henry, nicknamed Prince Henry the Navigator, perhaps some foreshadowing, commissioned a shipbuilding program that produced a fleet of ships specifically to navigate to India. He also hired cartographers to create maps of new geographical landscapes on the way to India as well. Portugal was also among the first to set several sailing records among Europe. In 1444, Portuguese explorers discovered Cape Verde, just off the western coast of Africa. In 1483, they reached the mouth of the Congo River. And by 1487, Bartholomew Dias sailed around the Cape of Good Hope. Portugal was well on their way to India. Spain, being the much larger big brother neighbor of Portugal, would not see them finding India before her. King Ferdinand V and Queen Isabella financed a relatively unknown Italian sailor named Christopher Columbus to find the route to India. Columbus was able to gain the support of the Spanish crown after he convinced them he could find India by doing something completely different from everyone else. Instead of sailing south, he would sail west. And since the Earth was round, it was a no-brainer that if you travel west far enough, you'll find the eastern side of the planet. To give credit where credit is due, Columbus was technically right, and in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. Yeah, sorry, I couldn't help myself. Things were looking good for Columbus until he ran into a small roadblock on his way to India, called North America, but more specifically the Caribbean islands. Fun little tidbit, it's true Columbus did not return to Spain with pepper or a new route to India. However, he did come back with a different spice. On his second voyage, he traveled to Haiti where he discovered the chili pepper. He brought the spicy pepper back to Spain where it was widely incorporated into Spanish cuisine. 50 years later, the chili pepper became a hit around the world. Ultimately though, Portugal being the busy bee, won the spice race in 1497, when Portuguese explorer Vasco da Gama found the route to India after spending 300 days at sea. Upon his return to Portugal, the spice cargo Vasco da Gama picked up was worth 60 times the cost it took to finance his nearly year-long voyage. Portugal, trailblazing the route to India, allowed other countries to follow suit. Numerous European nations invested heavily in these new spices and raw materials, eventually forming rival trade organizations such as the Dutch East India Company, the British East India Company, the French East India Company, the Swedish East India Company, and finally, as you probably guessed, the Portuguese East India Company. The spice race connected the East to the West, making international trade feasible and faster by 17th century standards. Now with countries getting rich from spices and the advancement in navigation techniques, the next race would be to colonize the New World. This would include Portugal colonizing present-day Brazil, France in Northern Africa and North America, England in India, Africa, Australia, and North America, and finally Spain in the remainder of North America and South America.